They told me at first it was a scheduling mistake, 3 sentences, a laugh, and a clipboard. They smiled, said it'd be easier for the neighbors, that Raven Ridge needed a community celebration, and my little cabin would be perfect. But when Martha Keene smiled at you like that, you learn quick she wasn't asking, she was taking, and by the time I realized what was happening, they had already printed the invitations. My name is Eli Mercer, and that cabin on the edge of Raven Ridge isn't some weekend Airbnb or picturesque prop, it's my father's porch. It's the rusted nail in the front step where my kid learned to balance. It's the place where we buried a shingle and swore to keep the land in the family. When Martha told me the HOA wanted to book it for an upscale gala, I laughed out of shock. Then I asked her the one question that matters. On what authority? She smoothed her skirt always a certain way, always certain, and said, flat as a judge, we voted. It's community property. There's a little trick people who run things like to use. Throw you a word that sounds official, community, and assume you won't notice the rest. I told her that my deed didn't say community, and that my name was on the county roll. She shrugged like she'd misplaced a pen, and that shrug told me everything. She believed she could rewrite reality if she could convince enough people. So I did the boring, small estate things that later turned out to be the decisive things. I changed the gate code. I put up a battered motion camera in the oak tree. I got a tow company on standby. Not glamorous in everyone's story, the hero does a grandstand, throws a legal bomb, but the truth is, ownership is mostly paper and a logbook and the habit of showing up, so I showed up. Saturday morning, the driveway filled with cars that should never have fit on our gravel road. Black SUVs, vans with catering logos, women in stilettos sinking into mud. They arrived with balloons and champagne, but what they wanted was permission, and permission had never been asked for properly. Martha marched up to the gate like a queen heading into a coronation, clipboard upright, and for a moment, standing on my porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, I watched her face. She had the same look people get when they realize they can make other people's lives fit into their hands. Eli, she said, voice bright the way your voice gets when you intend to hurt someone and call it business. We need you to open the gate. It's for everyone. There's no vote recorded that lets you use private property, I said. You can park in the lot like everyone else. She laughed a small sharp thing and called down. Neighbors, he's stalling. The crowd around her chimed in like they'd memorized lines. There were whispers about shared spaces and convenience, and what would this mean for future events, as if the future belonged to whoever could shout loudest. The sheriff's deputy Sam Ortega arrived after someone texted dispatch. He was the kind of man who looked as if he knew how to read property lines the way your grandmother could read a face. Patient, not easily startled. He asked for the deed. He asked me to step forward, and the air shifted. Martha's mouth tightened. Confidence has a fragile hinge, and that hinge squeaked when a uniform appears. The deputy reminded her she could not trespass, and for the first time the crowd that had come to cheer on her spectacle started shuffling, like people who were being asked to choose between gossip and a legal reality. That should have ended at a gate, a deputy, some simmering embarrassment, but a simmer is not a storm. In the days that followed, I found emails in an HOA folder, little things that didn't make sense. Payments to a landscaping company that matched the price of a week-long festival, minutes of meetings that were missing, margins on the ledger reallocated to community enhancements, the same week Martha's cousin billed for historic restoration of a trail I'd never seen fixed. There were backdated signatures, notarized forms with coffee stains that hadn't been there, and photographs from last year's sloppy, obvious sleight of hand if you know where to look. So we went quiet and we dug. You don't realize how much paper a community leaves behind until you start asking questions. I sent polite emails, the kind that read like someone trying to be reasonable, because you have to try that first, because if you don't, you're the guy who hates cake. Martha answered once with a thinly veiled insult. The board sent a form letter about transparency. I kept the camera footage saved in 2 places. I texted Lena Price, a new board member who had the sense to look uncomfortable at Martha's jokes. Lena showed up with a manila folder the next morning, and we started laying things out on my kitchen table like a puzzle. It's funny how criminal things are often obvious. Fraud, if you strip it down, is just someone using the smell of authority to cover a smell that doesn't belong to them. The proof was in invoices, in 2 separate landscaping companies billing for the same stretch of trail, in a check made out to a shell company that listed an address that, when you look on a Thursday, is a mailbox and a tourist office. When we called in an investigator, we were told the one thing every scared person who's ever been wronged wants to hear. Don't touch anything else. That made me madder than anything. Don't touch anything else while Martha's cousin is out buying vintage table settings with our money. Don't touch anything else while the HOA emails say they're rectifying. The situation rectifying what? That someone treated a neighborhood like their personal credit card? Then came the arrest. They came for Martha in front of her pond, with the goldfish and the hydrangeas she'd sworn were community plantings, and she looked at the deputies like someone who couldn't understand why everyone else was rude enough to be honest. She tried to wave it off as a misunderstanding, called it a political hit, but the prosecutor Cole Bennett had the patience of someone who'd listened to enough explanations to know which ones were lies. The charges were clear: misappropriation of funds, forgery of meeting minutes, conspiracy to defraud a civic body. It's a messy set of words that add up to the important thing. People can pay the price when they confuse entitlement with ownership. The trial was the kind of thing small towns gossip about for decades. People took sides, but what was interesting wasn't the outrage or the cheers so much as how surprised some neighbors seemed that the rules applied to Martha. There's a human tendency to assume people in power deserve power, like it's an heirloom. Watching her in the courtroom, stripped of the clipboard and the carefully calibrated smile, made you see how much of the cruelty was camouflage. If you can be in charge, you can pretend harm is policy. I testified. I tried not to be theatrical because the truth is more persuasive than drama, and also because I'm tired of the kind of theatrics that make a story about people into a story about a spectacle. I said what I saw: the gate, the vehicles, the invoices, and I talked about why that cabin mattered. Not the romantic kind of thing you see on TV, but the small ledger book version. My dad's initials carved into a porch beam. The time my mother planted a sapling and wrote the date on a paper plate and taped it to the trunk. The jury listened. Martha was convicted on several counts. The sentencing mentioned restitution and community service, but it also mentioned something I hadn't expected to hear: that the neighborhood needed to rebuild trust, and that rebuilding was going to take structure, not apologies. We elected a new board, and Lena and Greer, a volunteer who used to work in municipal accounting, pushed for transparency measures so basic it made my head spin. Public ledgers, streamed meetings, rotating oversight. It wasn't poetic, but it was stable. Here's the part that surprised me. After the verdict, the community didn't collapse into moral purity. Some neighbors still said Martha had been a visionary, that she'd done things for a reason, that the ends justified messy means. Others said we'd overreacted. Those arguments were noisy and furious and, honestly, healthy, because disagreement proves people care enough to fight. The true danger is apathy, the slow acquiescence to someone with a clipboard who says, "Trust me." I spent a lot of nights on that porch after everything, watching fog roll off the ridge, thinking about how justice unfolded in small places. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a deputy who checks deeds. Sometimes it's an email that refuses to die. Sometimes it's your neighbor bringing a folder and saying, "I think there's something wrong here." There's a humility to it, and a sweetness too, the way people show up when stakes are real. But I also wanted the ending to sting a little, so people would argue in the comments, so they'd remember that the story isn't over. Martha got a sentence, but her influence lingered in ways that money can't fix: a split in the neighborhood, old grudges that don't heal on paper. We fixed bylaws, and we didn't reopen the porch for any public gala. But the county land office still held parcels of ambiguity and the same human impulses that let anyone think they could rewrite rules with a smile. If you've ever had someone in your life treat a shared space like a personal stage, you'll recognize it: the way entitlement builds like plaque, how small concessions turn into habit. If you haven't, maybe this is a warning. Either way, I hope you remember that the simplest things are often what preserve you. Photocopies of deeds, a camera pointed at your gate, a neighbor who knows how to read a ledger. Don't romanticize the grand act. Build the boring defenses. So tell me, what would you have done? Do you think we were right to push for criminal charges? Or should this have stayed a community matter? Is transparency and public oversight the answer? Or does that invite government into every backyard? Drop your thoughts below. Tell your own stories if you've got them. And if nothing else, check your deed, lock your gate, and talk to the people next door before the clipboard shows up.